Hey guys, welcome to our online history class. So we are jumping into civil rights events today. We have two objectives for our lesson today. So number one, we're going to try to understand a little bit more about the process of making any kind of social or political change in the US. And then the second objective is to describe the way key leaders and events of the civil rights movement demonstrate that process. Today, we're going to be focusing on events during Eisenhower's term. So we're going to jump right into the process. Last lecture, we talked about the role of court cases in creating a foundation for change. We talked about that in the context of Brown versus Board of Education, desegregating schools. We also talked about, though, how there are limits on the court case or the court's ability to actually make change. So one of the limits we talked about is that the court is not directly empowered to enforce their rulings, right? The court does not have a military, so they can tell southern states, desegregate your schools. And then the southern states are like, whatever, man, right? And they just want to wait. So it's difficult for them to enforce those rulings quickly. The second limitation that I didn't mention is that also court cases often deal with only one specific context. So in this case, they're ordering the desegregation of schools, but that is limited in scope, right? It's not like they said desegregate all public facilities. Like, what about restaurants? What about hospitals, right? All they're ordering is the school desegregation. Okay, so often what happens after rulings then is activists are going to use a variety of means to draw attention to issues and lobby for government enforcement. So these are going to be individuals or groups that say, hey, did you guys notice schools are still segregated? What are you doing about that? Also, what about restaurants, right? Are we going to do something about that issue? So I want to spend one slide explaining some of the methods that activists use. And then we will talk about specific things. Okay, I'm sorry about that one at the bottom. We're going to get to that in a second. Okay, so let's look at the top where it says activists. Activists, by that, I mean a person or a group of people who take action to bring about political or social change. Okay, so some famous activists that you might think of would be like Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King, right? And often they're working in groups. So like the NAACP or the Martin Luther King had an organization as well. So those people or groups are putting pressure on institutions to make change. And there are a variety of methods they use to do that. The first one is economic, and that is called a boycott. So a boycott is when you convince a whole bunch of people not to buy something in order to pressure the business directly to make a change. So boycotts don't require government intervention, right? This is like, we're all upset about something that a business did, and we say, I don't want to buy from you. And because the business isn't making money, they independently make a choice to change their policy, right? So this would be like, I don't know, if I'm super upset with the advertising that Carl's Jr. is using, right? I'm like, are you guys selling hamburgers or are you selling sex? Like, I can't tell. Okay, and I get a whole bunch of other people together who are upset about this, and we all say we're not going to buy from Carl's Jr., and we put up signs or whatever. Then Carl's Jr. on their own might decide, okay, we're going to advertise differently so we can get this business back. It doesn't require federal government. It's just economic pressure. Okay, so that's the first thing. You can use a boycott to put pressure directly on the business. The second thing that activists often do is they will use protests like marches or other forms of nonviolent protest to draw national attention to issues and attempt to persuade the public of their cause. So they're basically trying to change people's minds about an issue. And the protests that tend to be really effective at this during the civil rights movement, at least, are nonviolent protests where protesters are getting beaten. Okay, and these work well because they get a lot of press, right? The press is interested in these protests. They're like, look at these people getting beaten, getting thrown in jail, getting hit with fire hoses. everybody look at this, right? So you get a lot of press, and then people are sympathetic to the protesters, especially when they see like 9-year-olds getting sprayed with fire hoses by the police department, right? They're like, whoa, something might be wrong here. And that's going to help change the public's mind. Okay, now, in order for this to fully work, though, you have to get to that last step, which has been up here for a while, and that is that the public puts pressure on the government to respond to these changing public views with law and enforcement. So if, for example, okay, let's just look at these pictures we have at the bottom, right? Okay, so on the left, you can see there's Rosa Parks, who was an activist, very famous for not giving up her seat on the bus. We'll talk about that more in a minute. In the second picture, you can see this is from the Birmingham March. That dog is attacking that guy right there. The Birmingham March actually included not only dogs, but also fire hoses were brought out on people. Martin Luther King and a whole bunch of other people were thrown in jail as a result of this protest. Okay, the thing is, though, if we take these pictures, people see the pictures, they get very upset. At this point, that's all that's happened, right? You have a bunch of people in jail and a bunch of people upset. That doesn't make a change. What makes a change is when all those people go and put pressure on the government and say, hey, change the law, right? And that gets us to, if you look at the far right picture, Civil Rights Act of 1964 actually desegregates all public facilities as a result of public pressure. Right, so this is a broad overview of how the process works, and then we're going to look at some specific events and how those events fit in. Okay, so the background to this is that post Brown versus Board of Education, there is a massive Southern resistance to the change. Like, the court is saying you guys need to desegregate schools, and Southern states are like, no, we do not want to do that. And in fact, after Brown versus Board is passed, Virginia begins a policy that is referred to as their massive resistance policy. They refuse to integrate public schools. They say that they will close schools that choose to integrate. The senator from Virginia introduces a document called the Southern Manifesto, which opposes integration, and that is signed by over 100 Southern congressmen. Okay, so basically the entire South is like, this is federal overreach. The court shouldn't be allowed to do this. Why are you messing with our society? And they're severely pushing back on this policy. They're going to encourage students not to attend integrated schools. So even in places where they're not shutting down the schools, they'll encourage parents to pull their kids out and put them in private schools. And also, we're going to see a reemergence of the KKK during this time. So they're going to use violent intimidation to try to stop a lot of this change. And you can see at the bottom some of these protesters that are going the other way, right? We won't go to school with Black students. Like, that's what they're saying. So this is the context of the activists deciding, okay, we need to push back on this backlash. So let's take a look at some of the we're going to look at two major events under Eisenhower's term. So the first is super famous, right? That's Rosa Parks pictured at the bottom. Most of you learned about Rosa Parks when you were younger. Rosa Parks is responsible for inciting the Montgomery bus boycott, which occurs 1 year after the Brown decision. So we're in 1955. Brown decision was 1954. So as most of you know, Rosa Parks was sitting on the bus. She refused to move to the back of the bus when a white passenger asked her to move, and she was arrested for doing that. So this is actually, remember, the same thing that happened to Plessy back in 1896, but the court did not side with Plessy, right? They were like, sorry, you're staying in jail. So in this case, the NAACP decided that there was court precedent for maybe the court would go the other way, right? They just ruled the other way in Brown, saying we're going to desegregate public schools. What about buses? Okay, the other thing we should probably mention about Rosa Parks is she is not just some random lady that got tired, right? Like, I feel like sometimes that's how it's taught in third grade. Like, she just was fed up and she didn't get up. Okay, Rosa Parks was the secretary of the NAACP in Montgomery. Like, this woman knew what she was doing. She was already an activist, and she took advantage of that situation to say, hey, I'm fed up. I am fed up, right? She was, but she's not just some random person. Like, she knows what she's doing. So she gets arrested. NAACP rallies around her, and they say, we're going to back you up with a boycott. Okay, remember we talked about that's one of the methods that activists use. So they get the whole entire African American community in Montgomery, which is in Alabama, by the way, to refuse to ride buses until the policies change. Okay, now, how is this a big deal? So the vast majority of bus riders in Montgomery were Black. If most of them decide we will no longer ride the bus, what happens to the bus company? Okay, so they're going to lose a lot of money, right? That's what happens. They're about to go under. And they have to decide, do we want to lose all of this money or do we want to change our policy? Okay, this boycott actually goes on for over a year. Okay, so this is the goal of the boycott, right? To create economic pressure and cause the bus companies to lose revenue so that they're put in this position where they have to decide, are we going to lose all this money or are we going to change the policy? Okay, the problem though, oh, and also I should probably mention, this is when Martin Luther King gets his moment because Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor in Montgomery. And so when all this happened, he got the churches together and he was like, I think that we should support this situation. Now, part of the problem, though, is that boycotts are not just burdensome to business, they are burdensome to the participants, right? All these people say we're not going to ride the bus. They still have to get to work, though, right? So, like, what are your options at this point? I'm not riding the bus. What else could I do? Okay, you could walk maybe, but what if your work is really far away? Like, maybe you could bike. Okay, but what else you might want to do is like get some people together who have cars and set up carpools, right? And that is what Martin Luther King Jr.'s church did. So the churches start putting together these carpool lists, like, hey, you can sign up and people who have cars will take you places. Okay, what this does though is it actually creates almost a war in the city. So Martin Luther King urges these churchgoers not to ride the bus and organizes these carpools. The insurance companies cancel the insurance policies of people who owned cars that were participating in this, right? So it's like the whole city is kind of at war over this policy. And many people were arrested for conspiring to make this boycott. You'll notice on the left, this tells you there's about 52,000 passengers and about 40,000 of them were Black. So this is the vast majority of the people that are saying we're not going to ride the bus. Okay, so how this thing resolves is actually not through the boycott. The boycott does create economic pressure, but the whole thing is resolved with another Supreme Court case. And it's actually not Rosa Parks' case. So Rosa Parks is not the only person who refused to get off the bus. She is a very famous person who did that, but she was not the first. And there were other people in the city that they decided might be better candidates for a court case. So this was the court case, Browder versus Gale. Browder was a young lady who also did not give up her seat and sued the mayor of the city. And that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled now that segregation on buses is also unconstitutional, right? So they're taking the Brown precedent and applying it to buses. Okay, the other big event we want to talk about under Eisenhower's term is in Little Rock, Arkansas. This is in 1957, so 3 years after the Brown ruling. And as we mentioned, many of these southern states were refusing to integrate their schools. So this event occurs in Little Rock, Arkansas at a high school called Central High School. 9 Black students attempted to attend Central High School. So they were the first students to integrate this school. And when they tried to go there, the governor of the state said no. So he said they could not attend. He was not going to abide by the court case. So for 3 weeks, the governor orders the National Guard to prevent these students from attending the school. Okay, now here's the crazy part. So then what you need when the state says no is federal government enforcement. And Eisenhower was talking with the governor of Arkansas. His name is Faubus. They're kind of going back and forth. And he was like, dude, you got to let these kids go to school, the Supreme Court said. And Faubus was like, not in my state. This is in my state. The Supreme Court doesn't get to tell me what to do. At the end of the 3 weeks, Eisenhower actually nationalizes the National Guard and sends in federal troops to ensure the safety of the students for the entire year, because clearly we need to make sure nothing happens to these students, right? Like, what if these students go to school and other students really seriously harm them, right? Like jump them or beat them up or something. Um, at that point, other Black parents are not going to be willing to put their kids in that position, right? They're like, I'm not going to send my kid to a school where they're going to get beat up. So we need to make sure that these kids are okay in order for this process to keep going. And that is what Eisenhower does. So what we're seeing here is this interplay between activists and federal government enforcement, right? You need these 9 students to be activists and say, yes, we'll go to the school. But then you also need the federal government to back them up. And on the left, you can see this is a super famous photo of one of the Black students entering the school. And then you can see that white student in the back yelling at her. Here you can see a picture of the National Guardsmen actually escorting the students into the school. And then here's another picture of them walking them around. So they escorted these students all year long. They would go into the bathrooms, clear the bathrooms, like make sure that they were not harmed for the entire year that they were in school. Okay, so what I want to do, last slide, we want to recap the events that we have talked about. So remember we talked about how the court case creates the foundation for change. We saw that with Brown versus Board of Education, desegregating the school, which then resulted in massive resistance from the South. And then at that point, the activists have to come in and start drawing attention to other related issues and pressuring the government enforcement for these changes. So we saw that with Rosa Parks, whose activism with the NAACP and Martin Luther King's organization. He actually creates his own organization called the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to bring churches together in the South. They facilitate a boycott to pressure buses to desegregate. And then the court case desegregates the buses, right? That other court case that we were talking about. And then with the Little Rock Nine, we saw 9 students that attempted to act on the rights established by the Brown case. When the governor resisted, the president enforces the law with troops. Okay, next block, we're going to be looking at events in JFK's term, including the Birmingham March and the sit-in movement. Woohoo. Thanks for hanging with our discussion of civil rights today. Love you guys. Hope you're staying safe. Bye.